takes us up to the present day. We want to start. Let's see. We'll do this in chronological order, and so I think we'll start with Julie. No, Jesse. Jesse was editor in 1993 and 1994. Jesse Holland now covers the Supreme Court for the Associated Press in Washington. He's quite a distinguished journalist there in Washington. He was the first African American elected to the very important Congressional Standing Committee, which determines who gets accredited and who does not. He's written a book that's called Black Men Built the Capitol, which is an excellent book about African American history in the Washington, D.C. area. And so I'd like to start with you, Jesse. You were the second African American to become editor of the Daily Mississippian. Was that hard, and if so, how was it hard to do?
Well, I was really lucky that I was the second. Because the first, Lee Eric Smith, took all of the heat. And by the time I came through, there was no controversy about having a black editor. There was also no controversy that the editor was selected instead of elected. Because in addition to being the first black editor, Lee Eric Smith was also the first editor not to have to campaign across campus to be editor. Mm. So I came about 2 or 3 editors after him. So by the time I got in, there was no controversy over the fact that the student body didn't elect me, and there was no controversy over the fact that I was black, the black editor of the Mississippian. I was just the editor of the Mississippian. All the controversy came over the stuff we did instead of who I was. So it was what we did.
So what do you remember from those controversies?
And you'll hear the name over and over, S. Gale Denley. One of the greatest things about working for the Mississippian was that you worked for the Mississippian. You didn't work for the campus. You didn't work for the student legislature. You worked for the newspaper. And one of the things you quickly learned from Mr. Denley was you made the decisions. If you made a correct decision, great, you got all the credit. But if you made a decision that was not quite so correct, you had no one to blame but yourself because he didn't make the decision. Most of the most controversial decisions that came during my time were things that we brought on ourselves. And one of the ones that sticks out in my mind right now was one I personally caused. It was the only time I think, and I'm not gonna speak for everyone, it's the only time I think that a African American editor of the Daily Mississippian was protested by the Black Student Union. and I caused this by myself. In addition to wanting to be a journalist back while I was at school, I also wanted to be a cartoonist. So one of the decisions I made that was not quite so popular was, instead of buying cartoon strips from like Nancy and Garfield and Doonesbury, I decided that students should produce their own cartoon strips. Student journalists might be a good idea. Student cartoonists, not quite so much. So after seeing the quality of some of the material that was being submitted, I decided that, well, if I'm a student, I can come up with a comic strip myself. So along with 2 of my friends, David Hitt and Lane Hughes, we decided we were going to have a satirical look at being outsiders at the University of Mississippi, which all Mississippian editors and writers basically were. You were outsiders. So we decided that we were going to come up with something that we were going to ensure everybody was going to read by giving it an appropriate title. And we said, okay, we'll look around the Mississippian. Who's here? We're gonna base it on the people we know. So we decided to call the strip Hippie and the Black Guy. Because that's what we saw in the Mississippian. And the But this is one smart thing that we did is we decided that David, Lane, and I, we wouldn't put our name on the strip. We would just put our initials. So the Monday after Hippie and the Black Guy started, the president of the Black Student Union comes down to the newspaper and says, "Where did you get this racist strip called Hippie and the Black Guy?" And I'm sitting there trying not to laugh. My hand's over my mouth. I'm trying not to laugh and say, well, this is the Daily Mississippian. We will run what we want to run. And the next day, out in front of Farley, the Black Student Union apparently has gone around campus, collected copies of the Mississippian, and brought them back to Farley. And this goes on for, I think, 2 or 3 days. And so finally, like by Thursday, I was like, okay, guys, I'll be honest, I'm writing this. And they're like, oh, you're doing this? Funny that after I revealed that I had a hand in it, the protest sort of vanished. But a lot, I was here during the Should the Band Play Dixie era. And it was when it started. When Should the Band Play Dixie. And we wrote editorials about the newspaper. And I have to say, something that was said earlier was a lot of the words in the newspaper, as editor, you don't personally have anything to do with. You just make sure that they get there. I had the most outstanding staff of people, because once we started writing editorials, and not just the editorial, we started writing news stories about this, we started getting telephone calls and letters that personally toward me, thinking that I'm writing all the words that are in the newspaper, so people are assuming that what the Mississippian is saying is coming directly from me, and so all of the hate mail and the phone calls at my apartment and my phone calls at the Mississippian were all directed toward me. So finally, the year I was there, I think I was the only African-American member of the Mississippian. My staff stopped letting me answer the phone. And just sitting, hearing the other end of the telephone call coming from my staff toward people who were directing their vitriol toward me still is one of the most amazing things I've ever listened to, because the staff was behind you. Everyone didn't agree with me, but they were behind the idea that the newspaper should print what the newspaper thought was the truth. And I had dinner with a bunch of my staff members last night, and still to this day, we are still, even though we haven't seen each other since the 1990s, we are still as close as we were when we left, because we all still believe that newspapers should print what they see to be correct, not what people think.
Okay. Jesse, you've gone out and seen a bigger world now, so you can take a little bit broader view than just Mississippi. How do you think newspapers and the media in general are doing in the area of diversity?
Right now, it's actually, to be completely honest, right now it's pretty tough, because the recession is hitting everyone in the industry. I think that to have the correct perspective and to speak to everyone that's in your audience, you need to have someone who represents everyone in the audience. You need to have men as well as women. You need to have representatives of all races to understand that the perspective that you're giving out there. And right now, it's not just African Americans aren't being hired in the industry, it's journalists aren't being hired in the industry. So in addition to everyone being overworked, we're also losing a perspective that I think is valuable for journalism in the future. But I think it's hopefully, as soon as we get to the business model that allow journalism to survive profitably on the internet, I think we'll get that reversed. Right now, I think AP's largest staff in the entire world is based in Washington. And I think we have maybe 100 reporters, and there's only 2 black reporters on the entire staff right now. One works in the White House, Darlene Superville works in the White House, and I work in the Supreme Court. And we're the only African-American reporters on staff. When I got to Washington in 2000, there were 15 of us. But when I got to Washington, there was also maybe almost 200 reporters covering Washington for AP. So as the numbers have gone down, the commitment to diversity has not decreased, but simply there aren't as many positions. So that's something I hope reverses when we get the industry to a point where we can actually start hiring more journalists instead of trying to figure out how much work we can do with the fewest number of journalists, which is where I think a lot of companies are right now.
Now, you have a big and important job covering the Supreme Court for the AP, which means really for the world. And a lot of young people might say, boy, I'd like to have a job like that. Any advice for how the people could rise to those heights?
One of the things that I always say when I speak to journalism classes now is what you don't want to do is you don't want to say, I want to work for a newspaper. You don't want to say, I want to work for a television station. You don't want to say, I want to work for a radio station or even a website. What you want to do is to say, I want to be the best journalist I can be in every medium. Because when I left school, you were either radio, TV, or newspaper. Those divisions don't exist anymore. To ensure that you have a job in journalism in the future, you need to be able to exist cross-media. And that was one of the great things that's one of the great things about working for the Mississippian and going to Ole Miss, is that this was one of the few journalism schools in the South where you could work, if you wanted to work in every medium, you could. I worked for the radio station, midnight to 4 a.m. After we put the paper to bed, I went across the hall to the radio station. I was a cameraman on the television station, and I was editor for the Mississippian. And to survive in our field right now, you have to be able to do everything. I am being dragged kicking and screaming into the Twitter age. Because one of the reasons why one of the professors here at Ole Miss said you should go work for The Wire is because, unlike newspapers, there's no page count for The Wire. You can write as much as you want to. And for someone who was a prolific writer who never could fit into his column inches, I thought that was fabulous. Now they're trying to force me to fit a whole story into 140 characters.
You're still clearing your throat after 140.
Exactly. And honestly, what I tell people who want to be journalists now is that you have to be willing and able to tell a story in every format. You need to be able to take photos with your phone camera. You need to be able to go on to a radio station, do a bit for a radio station or a podcast, and then you need to be able to write the words. It is going to be, for the future, it's going to be impossible for a journalist to say, I am just a writer. And that's something that we're having to adjust ourselves. Some of us, I hate to call myself an older journalist in this crowd, but some of us, we're having to adjust ourselves slowly to the idea that we can't just write. We need to be able to do everything. And coming out of school for journalism students, you need to be able to do everything if you want to survive in this industry.